An elite violinist dared a homeless veteran to play the hardest piece of violin music. Unaware, he was a genius musician. The night was supposed to be flawless. The city's elite gathered high above the skyline, champagne in hand, when the unthinkable happened. A ragged old man stepped through the grand archway, his boots trailing dust across the polished floor. "Who let that in?" whispered a guest in silver, clutching her mink. Moments later, the first-chair violinist himself sneered, "Remove this person immediately. This is a private event." But the man didn't leave. He set his eyes on the priceless Guarneri violin and said softly, "Please, just one song. I'll play for a plate of food." That's when Harrison Vance, the city's cultural king, smiled coldly and declared, "Very well. Play Paganini's Caprice No. 24, the hardest piece of violin music. If you can survive 30 seconds without sounding like a strangled cat, you'll eat. If you fail, you'll be thrown out." What started as a moment of mockery ended as a revelation that shook an entire room of power and privilege. This is the story of how a forgotten soldier silenced the mighty with nothing but a violin. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. A man's worth is not measured by his coat, but by the symphony he carries in his soul. This was a truth the city's finest were about to learn. They just had no idea the lesson would be so severe. The Celestial Ballroom was a universe of its own, floating above the city on the 80th floor of the newly built Onyx Tower. The air inside was a carefully curated blend of night-blooming jasmine and the crisp, clean scent of money. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a carpet of city lights twinkling far below, a sight meant to remind the 200 guests that they were, quite literally, above it all. They were a constellation of inherited fortunes, surgical geniuses, and corporate titans who navigated the world with the frictionless ease of those who never had to check a price tag. Laughter, as delicate and sharp as shattered champagne flutes, bounced off the polished obsidian floors. Conversations flowed around a single, magnetic center, Harrison Vance. At 42, Harrison was the city's reigning cultural king. He was the first-chair violinist of the Metropolitan Philharmonic, a man whose talent was matched only by his staggering arrogance. His face was a study in handsome cruelty, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to assess and dismiss everything they saw with the same cold precision he applied to his music. Tonight was his coronation. The Starlight Conservatory Gala was an event he had orchestrated to launch a new scholarship fund for underprivileged musicians. It was a noble cause on paper, but in reality, it was another stage for Harrison to perform his favorite role, the benevolent patron, the gatekeeper of high culture. His tuxedo was a custom-tailored masterpiece, and the diamond pin on his lapel was a quiet scream of his own importance. He held his champagne flute like a scepter, a circle of admirers hanging on his every word. "The problem with modern music," Harrison was saying, his voice a smooth baritone that captivated his audience, "is a lack of discipline. True artistry isn't born from passion. It is forged in a crucible of relentless, punishing practice. It belongs to those with the breeding and the resources to pursue perfection." He took a delicate sip. "The rabble have their folk songs. We have Beethoven. It is the natural order of things." His followers nodded, their expressions a mixture of agreement and adoration. To them, Harrison wasn't just a musician, he was a belief system. He was proof that a world of rarefied beauty existed, and that they, the chosen few, were its rightful inhabitants. The centerpiece of this belief system rested on a velvet pedestal in the center of the room, the Vieux-Temps Guarneri del Gassou, a violin crafted in 1741. It was one of the rarest, most expensive instruments in the world, on loan for the evening as a symbol of the very perfection Harrison preached. Its dark amber would seem to glow from within, holding centuries of musical genius in its silent, elegant form. Into this sealed, perfect world, a specter appeared. He did not burst through the doors. He simply materialized in the grand archway, as if he had walked out of a forgotten alleyway in history. He was an old man, his face a roadmap of hard years and harsher weather. A threadbare army surplus jacket, faded to the color of dried moss, hung from his stooped shoulders. His boots were scuffed and cracked, and with each hesitant step onto the pristine floor, they left behind the faint, ghostly outline of dust and dirt. His gray hair was a tangled mess, and a beard of the same salt and pepper shade obscured a jaw set with a quiet, stubborn determination. He wasn't just out of place. He was a tear in the room's expensive fabric, an affront to its calculated elegance. A ripple of silence spread out from the entrance, moving like a cold draft through the warm, perfumed air. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned, and eyes that were experts at appraising wealth now narrowed with a uniform expression of confusion and disgust. Who let that in? A woman in a shimmering silver gown whispered to her husband, pulling her mink stole a little tighter, as if the man's poverty were a chill she could physically feel. From a corner table, the hotel manager, a perpetually nervous man named Mr. Gable, saw the old man and felt a jolt of pure panic. He began to make his way through the crowd, his face pale, already composing his groveling apology to Mr. Vance. The old man seemed oblivious to the rising tide of hostility. His eyes, a faded but piercing blue, scanned the room. They weren't the pleading eyes of a beggar or the vacant eyes of the lost. They were the calm, assessing eyes of a scout surveying hostile terrain. He took in the glittering jewelry, the disdainful sneers, the silent judgment. He saw it all, and his expression remained unreadable. He clutched a long, battered case in his left hand, holding it not with the desperation of a vagrant clinging to his only possession, but with the familiar ease of a craftsman holding his tools. Security. Harrison Vance's voice cut through the whispers, sharp and imperious. He had spotted the intruder, and his handsome face was twisted into a mask of pure indignation. Remove this person immediately. This is a private event. We paid a fortune for exclusivity, not to be accosted by street filth. Two burly security guards in black suits began to move from the sides of the ballroom. They converged on the old man with a heavy, purposeful tread, their faces grim and set. The crowd watched, a collective breath held in anticipation of the grubby, pathetic scene that was about to unfold. It was the predictable drama of their world, the unwelcome being made to disappear. But the old man did not cower. He did not shrink away. He simply took another slow step forward, his voice a low rumble that was shockingly out of place among the evening's lighter tones. "Excuse me," he said, his voice raspy, weathered by years of disuse. "I don't mean to intrude." The guards paused, thrown off for a second by the man's calm. He wasn't resisting. He was addressing the room. The old man's gaze drifted past the offended faces and landed on the magnificent violin resting on its velvet throne. A flicker of something profound and deeply personal passed through his eyes, a look of reverence, of longing, of an old and intimate familiarity. I saw the instrument. The Guarneri. I have not seen one in 50 years. Harrison Vance let out a short, barking laugh of disbelief. "You know what that is? I highly doubt that. Now, if you'll kindly—" "Please," the old man interrupted, his voice a little stronger now, cutting through Harrison's condescension. "I don't want money. I don't want a handout." He took a deep breath, and the absurd, impossible request hung in the silent, rarefied air. "I am hungry, sir. If I could just play it, just one song. I would be grateful for a plate of food from your kitchen." For a moment, there was only stunned silence. The sheer audacity of the plea was incomprehensible. A vagrant, asking to touch the Vuxtemps Guarneri, to play it, for a meal. Then the laughter began. It started with Harrison. He threw his head back and roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated mockery that echoed through the vast ballroom. It was a cruel, braying sound, and it gave the rest of the room permission to join in. A wave of derisive laughter washed over the old man, a chorus of the privileged ridiculing the desperate. He stood his ground, his gaze still fixed on the violin, his expression as still and unmoving as a stone. Near the service entrance, a young woman named Clara Jenkins watched, her stomach twisting into a tight knot. She was a music student at the conservatory, working as a waitress to pay for her rent and the exorbitant cost of her cello lessons. She recognized the look in the old man's eyes as he stared at the violin. It was the same look of holy reverence she felt every time she opened her own cello case. She saw the quiet dignity in his posture, a dignity the rest of the room was determined to strip from him. Her grandfather, a veteran of a long-forgotten war, had that same bearing. A man who had faced down horrors she could never imagine and now had to endure the small, daily indignities of a world that had moved on without him. She picked up a glass of water, her first instinct to offer this man a small, simple kindness. But as she took a step forward, Mr. Gable, the manager, grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Don't you even think about it," he hissed, his eyes darting nervously toward Harrison Vance's table. "He is not our guest. He is a problem for security to handle. You will not get involved, or you will be fired before he even hits the sidewalk. Do you understand me, Miss Jenkins?" Clara froze, her heart caught in a painful tug-of-war between her conscience and the desperate need for her job. She looked back at the old man, trying to send him a silent apology, a flicker of solidarity. Their eyes met for a brief, fleeting second, and in his gaze, she saw not shame, but a strange, weary understanding. He knew. He had expected this. "Get him out," Harrison shouted again, his face now red with anger. He was on his feet, gesturing wildly at the security guards who had resumed their advance. "This is exactly the kind of decay we are trying to fight. This is what happens when you let standards slip. He is contaminating the very air we breathe." The guards reached the old man, each one taking an arm. The crowd quieted, ready for the final, sad act of his ejection. But the old man did not struggle. He simply raised his free hand, a gesture that was not one of defiance, but of quiet command. "Please," he said again, his voice steady, directed now at Harrison. "Just one song. That's all I'm asking. For a hot meal. I haven't eaten in 2 days." It was, of course, a carefully constructed lie. He had eaten a simple but filling bowl of soup at a downtown shelter just that afternoon. But this was not about food. It was about them. He needed to see the full, unvarnished measure of their character. He needed to know what lay beneath the polished veneer of their philanthropy when they were confronted with the very kind of person they claimed to be helping. This entire evening, this whole charade, was a test, and the subjects had no idea their souls were being graded. Harrison's eyes lit up with a sudden, malicious spark. He saw an opportunity not just to remove the man, but to turn his humiliation into a form of entertainment for his guests. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He held up his hands, silencing the room. "You know what?" he announced, his voice booming with a false, theatrical magnanimity. "All right, let's let him play." A confused murmur rippled through the ballroom. His followers looked at him, bewildered. "Yes," Harrison continued, stepping onto the low stage to better address his audience. He was in his element now, the master of ceremonies. "Let us give our visitor a chance, an opportunity to prove his worth." He savored the absolute power he felt, every eye in the room fixed on him. He pointed a long, elegant finger at the old man. "Here is the arrangement. You wish to play our beloved Guarneri, a violin worth more than every life in your miserable tenement combined. You say you are hungry." Harrison paused for dramatic effect, letting the tension build. "You will play one piece, but it will not be a song of your choosing. It will be a song of my choosing. We will see if a man of your station can handle true music." He scanned the faces of his guests, a ringmaster working his crowd. "I will choose the most technically demanding piece ever written for the violin. Paganini's Caprice No. 24. It is a piece that makes even seasoned professionals tremble." A wave of excited, cruel whispers went through the room. They knew the piece. It was a breathtaking nightmare of impossibly fast passages, double-stop harmonics, and left-hand pizzicato. It was a musical Everest. "If," Harrison continued, his voice dripping with condescension, "if you can play the first 30 seconds of it without sounding like a cat being strangled, I will personally have the chef prepare you the finest steak in this hotel. You may eat it in the kitchen, of course." The crowd tittered. The game was set. "But," Harrison added, his voice dropping to a dramatic hush, "when you fail, and you will fail, spectacularly, our security guards will escort you out. You will not get your meal. And we will all have learned a valuable lesson about the difference between ambition and ability. We will witness, firsthand, what happens when those who have earned nothing demand a place among those who have earned everything." The old man, whose name was Arthur Morgan, felt a cold, familiar calm settle over him. It was the same feeling he'd had long ago, hunkered down in a frozen foxhole, waiting for the enemy to make their move. The trap was laid. The first part of his own lesson was about to begin. The circle of eager, predatory faces around him felt like a Roman arena. They were hungry for his failure, for the confirmation of their own superiority. "Place your bets, everyone," Harrison shouted, turning the humiliation into a grotesque parlor game. "How many notes will he manage before he gives up? I'll wager $100 he can't even tune it," a man in the back called out, to a fresh round of laughter. 200 says he snaps a string, laughed a woman adorned with a king's ransom and sapphires. Arthur watched them, his expression unreadable. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I accept your terms," he said, his voice quiet. Harrison grinned, a wolfish, triumphant expression. "Excellent. Guards, release him. Let the performance begin." The guards let go of Arthur's arms, stepping back with smirks on their faces. Arthur walked slowly toward the stage, adopting a pained, weary shuffle. Every movement was calculated. Every flicker of his eyes was part of the act. He climbed the 2 short steps to the stage, his body language screaming a lifetime of defeat. Harrison gestured grandly to the violin. "It's all yours. Try not to drop it." Arthur approached the pedestal. He made his rough, calloused hands tremble slightly as he reached for the priceless instrument. His dirt-caked fingernails and worn knuckles looked shockingly alien against the flawless, gleaming wood of the Guarneri. "Be careful with that," Mr. Gable, the manager, squeaked from the sidelines, wringing his hands in agony. "That instrument is a national treasure." Arthur picked up the violin. He held it for a moment, feigning awkwardness, as if he wasn't sure how to properly position it under his chin. In reality, the weight of it, the perfect balance, the smooth curve of the neck, it all felt like coming home. He had played on instruments just like this in the grand music halls of Europe, long before anyone in this room was even born. But tonight, he was not that man. He was a ghost, a reflection of their own callousness, a vessel for the truth they had all forgotten. He then reached for the bow, its horsehair shimmering under the chandeliers. He fumbled with it for a second, almost dropping it, drawing a fresh wave of snickers from the audience. Harrison had pulled up a velvet chair to the edge of the stage, settling in to enjoy the spectacle like a king at a public execution. "Before you begin your masterpiece," Harrison sneered, "let's make this even more interesting. I am a gambling man, after all." He stood up again, raising his voice. "If, by some impossible, cosmic miracle, you not only play the 30 seconds, but you play the entire piece, and you play it well enough to make a single person in this room shed a genuine tear of emotion, I will give you $10,000. Cash." The ballroom erupted. The insult was exquisite. $10,000 was a bar tab to these people. Offering it as the grand prize for an impossible feat was the ultimate expression of their contempt. It was a way of saying that his greatest, most unimaginable achievement was worth less than their pocket change. "He'll have a heart attack just thinking about that much money," someone bellowed. Arthur stood on the stage, the violin tucked awkwardly under his chin. He looked out at the sea of mocking faces. He saw Clara, the young waitress, watching from the kitchen entrance, her own face a mask of shame and pity for them. He saw one of the security guards shift his weight, his expression no longer smug, but uncomfortable. He even saw a few of the older guests look away, a faint blush of embarrassment coloring their cheeks. The cruelty was becoming too stark, even for some of them. But Harrison was basking in it. "What's the matter, old man?" he taunted. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you just now realizing the colossal mistake you've made?" Arthur remained silent. He needed their arrogance to be absolute. He needed their certainty of his failure to be a concrete wall before he began to tear it down, note by painful, perfect note. "He probably has no formal education," Harrison declared to the room, playing to his audience. "No training. But we must be patient. We can't expect a man who has clearly squandered every chance life ever gave him to understand the meaning of discipline." Arthur slowly lifted his head, his pale blue eyes finding Harrison's. "Chances," he murmured, his voice just loud enough to be heard in the sudden quiet. "Oh, he speaks." Harrison clapped his hands in sarcastic delight. "Yes, chances. The opportunities we are all given to make something of ourselves. Everyone in this room took theirs. That's why we're here, and you're there." "And what chances was I given?" Arthur asked, his voice soft, but clear as a bell. The question caught Harrison off guard. "What does that matter?" That's irrelevant. What matters is what a person does with what they're given. And what did I do? Arthur asked, his voice still gentle, but with an edge of steel just beneath the surface. Clearly, nothing. Harrison exploded, his patience finally snapping. He stepped right up to the edge of the stage, his face inches from Arthur's. Look at yourself. You are a complete and utter failure. A nobody. A ghost haunting the edges of a world you were too weak to conquer. Now play your pathetic notes and get out of my sight. The venom in his voice was so potent that it shocked even some of his most ardent admirers. Harrison had crossed a line, moving from theatrical cruelty to something deeply, viciously personal. A hush fell over the room. This was it, the moment of truth. 200 people waited for the clumsy, dissonant screech of the bow. They waited for the pathetic sounds that would confirm their worldview, that would prove that some people were simply born to be better and others were born to fail. Arthur looked down at the violin in his hands, then placed the bow on the strings. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the vacant, weary look was gone. In its place was a focus so intense, so profound, that Harrison, standing right in front of him, felt an involuntary shiver of unease. Well, Harrison demanded, but his voice had lost some of its booming confidence. Get on with it. Arthur took a slow, deep breath. Then he began to play. It did not start with a screech. It did not start with a clumsy, amateurish scrape. It started with a single, perfect note. A flawless, resonant A, played with a control so absolute that it seemed to vibrate the very air in the room. It was not loud, but it was impossibly pure, a drop of liquid gold that hung in the silence, cutting through the cynical atmosphere like a surgeon's scalpel. He held the note for 5 full seconds, letting its power and its mystery sink into every person present. When the note finally faded, the silence that followed was different. It was no longer the silence of cruel anticipation. It was the silence of stunned, genuine shock. Beginner's luck, Harrison muttered, but a deep frown creased his forehead. He was a master of the instrument. He knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that a note like that was not luck. That note was the product of a lifetime of devotion. Arthur's fingers moved on the fingerboard, his left hand a blur of perfect placement. His right arm, which had seemed so stiff and old, now moved the bow with an unnatural, fluid grace. He didn't launch into the pyrotechnics of the Paganini. Not yet. Instead, he began with a melody they didn't recognize. It was simple, haunting, and infused with a profound sense of loss. It sounded like an old folk song, something born in the Appalachian Mountains or on a lonely, windswept prairie. It spoke of rain-soaked fields and long marches, of letters never sent, of the faces of friends lost too soon. It was a soldier's lament, and he played it with the heartbreaking authenticity of a man who had lived every single note. What is that? A woman whispered to her companion. I've never heard anything like it. It's sorrowful. Harrison leaned forward in his velvet chair, his eyes narrowed in concentration. This was not part of the plan. This was not the cringeworthy spectacle he had promised his guests. This bum, this vagrant, was playing with a level of emotional depth that Harrison himself, for all his technical brilliance, had always struggled to achieve. The simple melody began to build. Arthur's bowing became more forceful, his vibrato more intense. The music filled every corner of the ballroom, a strange and powerful magic that began to work on the crowd. The whispers stopped. The waiters, who had been discreetly circling with trays of champagne, froze in place. Even the security guards had turned, their faces slack with wonder. The music was a magnet, pulling every ounce of attention in the room toward the shabby old man on the stage. He must have heard it somewhere, Harrison said to the man next to him, his voice tight with anxiety. He was desperately trying to find a logical explanation, to shrink the old man and his talent back down to a manageable, non-threatening size. Anyone can memorize a simple tune, but even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. He could see the subtle shifts in tempo, the masterful control of dynamics, the way Arthur leaned into a note to give it more weight and color. This was not mimicry. This was artistry of the highest order. For a few moments, Arthur allowed a fraction of his true virtuosity to show. He wove a second melody into the first, a counterpoint so fast and intricate that several people in the audience gasped aloud. His fingers, which had looked so rough and clumsy just moments before, now danced over the fingerboard with a speed and precision that seemed to defy the laws of physics. For 10 breathtaking seconds, he played like a god, a torrent of musical genius that was as shocking as it was beautiful. "My God," a man in the front row breathed, his voice trembling. Harrison shot up from his chair, his face a mask of utter disbelief. "Impossible," he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. He cannot do that." And just as quickly as it had appeared, the brilliant flash of mastery vanished. Arthur returned to the simpler, sadder melody, as if that incredible burst of skill had been a mere daydream. He was playing with them, toying with their expectations, reeling them in. He finished the piece with a few soft, final notes that faded into a profound, ringing silence. No one moved. No one spoke. No one even seemed to breathe. They had come expecting a circus act, and had instead witnessed a miracle. Clara was openly weeping now, tears streaming down her face and dripping onto her white apron. The music had unlocked a place of grief in her she had long kept hidden, her sorrow for her grandfather, who had come home from his war a different, quieter, sadder man, and had never spoken a word about what he had seen. Slowly, an elderly gentleman with kind, intelligent eyes rose from his table. His name was Samuel Peterson, a man who had built a manufacturing empire from nothing but grit and an uncanny understanding of human nature. He had been a patron of the arts for 50 years and knew a master's touch when he heard it. He walked slowly toward the stage, stopping a few feet from Arthur. His eyes were not filled with pity, but with a deep, soul-shaking respect. "Young man," he said, his voice raspy with age, but gentle. "Where in God's name did you learn to play like that?" Arthur looked up at him. For the first time all evening, he dropped the act of the beaten-down vagrant. He truly met someone's gaze, and his eyes were clear and steady. "Here and there, sir," he replied, his voice even. "My father taught me the basics. The army taught me the rest." The answer was cryptic, yet entirely true. His father, a poor farmer with a love of music, had indeed shown him his first chords on a battered fiddle. But it was in the long, terrifying nights in field hospitals and muddy trenches, playing on whatever cheap instrument he could find, that music had become his anchor. It had become his language for the unspeakable things he had witnessed. The army hadn't taught him technique. It had taught him what music was for. It had taught him about the human soul. Mr. Peterson nodded slowly, a flicker of an old memory playing at the edge of his mind. "Your father was a fine teacher. And the army, it seems it was, too." Harrison Vance could not stand it any longer. His perfectly curated evening, his moment of triumph, was being stolen from him by a homeless man. "Peterson, don't be a fool," he snapped, marching toward the stage, his face a thunderous mask of rage. "You can't seriously be falling for this sentimental garbage. He's a nobody. People like him don't play the violin. They don't have the education, the breeding, the access." "Access to what exactly?" Arthur asked softly. His voice cut through Harrison's tirade like a hot knife, silencing him instantly. Harrison sputtered, caught off guard. To proper training. To the best teachers. To conservatories." Arthur allowed a small, sad smile to touch his lips. "With all due respect, sir," he said, his eyes sweeping across the silent, watching crowd. "You don't learn music in expensive schools. You learn it by living. You learn it by hurting. You learn it when the melody in your head is the only thing keeping you from going insane in the dark. You learn it when you have nothing else left." His words, simple and powerful, resonated through the ballroom. They exposed the poverty of Harrison's own worldview. "Play again," Mr. Peterson requested, his voice soft. "Please." Arthur turned his attention from the crowd. His eyes locked with Harrison's. A silent challenge passed between them. The time for games was over. He raised the guarneri to his shoulder one more time. His posture shifted. The humble, defeated slump was gone. He stood straight and tall, a soldier at attention. "As per our agreement," Arthur said, his voice now devoid of its earlier rasp, "Paganini's Caprice No. 24. Then, he unleashed the storm. If the first piece had been a lament, a quiet river of sorrow, what came next was a hurricane. It was a torrent of sounds so complex, so powerful, and so impossibly fast that the human ear could barely keep up. The opening notes of Paganini's Caprice No. 24 are a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down by a composer who delighted in pushing the violin to its absolute limits. Arthur didn't just meet the challenge, he transcended it. His bow arm was no longer human. It was a piston of controlled fury, a blur of motion that attacked the strings with a ferocity that seemed to defy his age. The first variation, a cascade of 16th notes, flew from the guarneri not as a series of individual sounds, but as a single, shimmering sheet of pure musical energy. The notes were perfectly distinct, each one a tiny, polished diamond, yet they came so fast that they blended into a breathtaking whole. Harrison Vance stumbled backward, his face ashen. He physically recoiled as if the music were a physical force, a wave of heat and light. He knew every note of this piece. He had spent 6 torturous months of his life mastering it, and even on his best day, he could not play the opening with such effortless, terrifying precision. It wasn't just the speed. It was the tone. Each note was rich, full-bodied, and imbued with a confidence that bordered on divine arrogance. This wasn't a man playing a piece of music. This was a man channeling the very soul of the composer, a man speaking a language he had been born to command. The crowd was no longer a collection of individuals. They were a single entity, a collective being held in a state of suspended animation. Champagne glasses were forgotten, held midway to lips. A woman's hand was frozen over her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. They were witnessing something impossible, a violation of the natural order as they understood it. A dirty, homeless man was not just playing the world's hardest violin piece. He was conquering it. He was owning it. He was rewriting what they believed was possible. Arthur's body was transformed. The weary, stooped posture had been shed like an old skin. He stood with the unshakable poise of a general on a battlefield, his back ramrod straight, his entire being focused on the 4 strings and the horsehair bow. His left hand, which they had mocked for its calloused roughness, moved up and down the fingerboard with a spidery, supernatural speed. The passages of left-hand pizzicato, a technique that requires plucking the strings with the fingers of the hand that is also stopping the notes, were not the clumsy, thudding sounds produced by lesser musicians. They were a series of crisp, bell-like tones, a percussive counter-rhythm to the bow's soaring melody. He moved into the third variation, a series of wickedly fast octaves that require the hand to stretch and contort in ways that seem unnatural. Harrison watched, his jaw slack, his professional mind frantically trying to process what his eyes were seeing. The old man wasn't just playing the octaves. He was playing them with a flawless, singing intonation. Each pair of notes was perfectly in tune, a feat that Harrison himself, with all his years of conservatory training, could only achieve on a good day, and even then with a hint of strain. This man, this ghost, was playing them as if it were the easiest thing in the world, a simple nursery rhyme. Clara, the young waitress, had sunk to her knees just inside the kitchen doorway. She was no longer crying from sorrow. She was crying from the sheer, overwhelming beauty of it all. As a music student, she understood better than most the sheer impossibility of what she was hearing. This wasn't just talent. This was a force of nature, a gift from a higher power. It was a level of mastery that most musicians spent their entire lives dreaming of and never even came close to touching. She felt a profound sense of shame for her earlier pity. This man didn't need anyone's pity. He was a king. Arthur's eyes were closed, but he wasn't lost in the music. He was in complete, absolute control. He was aware of every rustle of clothing, every sharp intake of breath in the room. He could feel Harrison Vance's world shattering. He could feel the foundations of their arrogance cracking and crumbling under the weight of each perfect, undeniable note. This was his true battlefield. This was his weapon. He was not just playing a song. He was performing an exorcism, driving the demons of pride and prejudice out of that gilded, hollow room. He reached the 9th variation, the one with the infamous double-stop harmonics, where the player must lightly touch the string in 2 places at once to produce a high, ethereal, flute-like sound. It is a moment in the piece where even the greatest virtuosos often falter, where a slight miscalculation in pressure or placement can result in a hideous screech. Harrison held his breath. This had to be where it ended. The old man's luck had to run out. Arthur's fingers barely seemed to touch the strings. He caressed them, his touch as light as a whisper. And from the body of the ancient violin came a sound that was not of this world. A sequence of impossibly high, impossibly pure notes floated through the ballroom, a celestial choir that silenced every cynical thought. It was the sound of angels weeping. It was so beautiful, so achingly perfect, that it was almost painful to hear. That was the moment that broke Harrison Vance. It wasn't a loud, dramatic snap. It was a quiet, internal implosion. The music had bypassed his pride, his anger, his professional jealousy, and had struck him directly in the core of his being, in the place where his own love for the violin was born. In that pure, unearthly sound, he heard the echo of his own deepest, most secret failure. For all his fame, for all his technical skill, he had never been able to make a violin sing with that kind of soul. His playing was a marvel of mechanics. This old man's playing was a marvel of the human spirit. A single tear, hot and shameful, escaped his eye and traced a path down his cheek. He tried to hide it, to turn his head, but it was too late. Mr. Peterson, standing nearby, saw it. He saw the complete and utter defeat of the arrogant maestro. Arthur played on, his energy never flagging. He was a whirlwind of motion and sound, a man possessed by a genius that was both terrifying and sublime. The final variation is a brutal, relentless assault on the instrument, a furious climax that brings together all the technical challenges of the preceding sections. Arthur did not just play it, he attacked it. He tore into it with a passion that was almost violent, his bow digging into the strings, drawing out a sound that was raw, powerful, and utterly commanding. The final, crashing chord echoed through the ballroom, a thunderclap that seemed to shake the very foundations of the skyscraper. Then, there was silence. A silence so deep, so absolute, it felt more profound than any sound. For 10 long seconds, no one moved. The 200 guests stood or sat as if turned to stone, their minds reeling, their souls scorched. They had been taken to the summit of a mountain and shown a view of existence they had never known was possible. Then, Mr. Samuel Peterson, the old industrialist, did something that no one in that room had ever seen him do. He raised his hands and began to clap. It was not the polite, rhythmic applause of a concert hall. It was a slow, deliberate, powerful clap of genuine, heartfelt reverence. One by one, others joined him. A woman in the front row, her face streaked with mascara, began to clap. A man who had minutes earlier been mocking Arthur's shabby clothes was on his feet, his hands a blur. Within 30 seconds, the entire ballroom was a roaring, thunderous ovation. It was an explosion of pent-up emotion, a wave of gratitude and awe that washed over the man on the stage. They were not just clapping for the music. They were clapping to atone for their own cruelty. It was an apology, a surrender, a coronation. They were applauding a king they had mistaken for a beggar. Only one person was not clapping. Harrison Vance stood frozen, his face a grotesque mask of shock and humiliation. The applause was like a physical assault, each clap a blow to his ego. He looked at Arthur, who was now standing quietly, the violin held loosely at his side. The old man's face was calm, his expression unreadable. There was no triumph in his eyes, no "I told you so." There was only a quiet, weary sadness. Arthur lowered the violin and placed it gently back on its velvet pedestal. He turned and looked out at the sea of faces, his gaze sweeping over them until it landed on Harrison. "The stake is no longer necessary," Arthur said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the now silent room. "And you can keep your $10,000. That was not why I played." He started to walk off the stage, his mission accomplished. The crowd parted for him as if he were royalty, a path clearing through the glittering assembly of the city's most powerful people. They stared at him with a new kind of awe, their earlier disdain replaced by a deep and unsettling shame. Who was this man? Where had he come from? "Wait," a voice called out. It was Mr. Peterson. He had followed Arthur to the edge of the stage, his face pale, his eyes wide with a dawning, impossible recognition. He was staring at Arthur's face, at the line of his jaw, the shape of his eyes, the way he held himself. The years, the beard, the hardship had hidden it, but now, stripped of the act, he could see it. "I know you," Mr. Peterson whispered, his voice trembling. "It can't be. It's impossible. You died." Arthur stopped and turned to face him. He gave a small, tired smile. "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated, Samuel. As you can see, Mr. Peterson took a shaky step forward, his hand reaching out as if to touch a ghost. Arthur. Arthur Morgan? Is it really you? A collective gasp went through the room. The name hung in the air, electric and unbelievable. Arthur Morgan. It was a name from a legend, a myth whispered about in the hallowed halls of conservatories and concert venues. He had been the greatest violin prodigy of his generation, a once-in-a-century talent who had debuted at Carnegie Hall at the age of 16 to reviews that called him the heir to Paganini himself. He had been a musical demigod, selling out every concert hall in Europe, his name synonymous with perfection. Then, in 1951, at the height of his fame, he had been drafted to fight in Korea, and he had simply vanished. He was listed as missing in action, presumed dead. The music world had mourned the loss of its brightest star, a genius cut down in his prime. For 70 years, the name Arthur Morgan had been a ghost story, a cautionary tale about the fragility of genius. And now, that ghost was standing in the celestial ballroom, dressed in a tattered army jacket. You are your Arthur Morgan? Harrison Vance stammered, his voice cracking. The name was like a holy word to him. Morgan was his idol, the impossible standard against which he had measured his entire life and career. He had spent hours listening to the old, scratchy recordings of Morgan's pre-war performances, marveling at a talent that seemed inhuman. And he had just told this man, his god, that he was a failure, a nobody, street filth. The sheer, cosmic magnitude of his error crashed down on him, and his legs gave out. He stumbled backward and collapsed into a chair, his face buried in his hands, his body racked with silent, convulsive sobs. Every eye in the room was now on Arthur, but their expressions had changed again. The awe was still there, but it was now mixed with a profound, gut-wrenching shame. They had not just mocked a homeless man. They had mocked a legend. They had thrown their petty scorn at a national hero, a man who had sacrificed his art, his fame, and his life for his country, only to return to a world that judged him by the quality of his coat. The name, Arthur Morgan, echoed in the silent hall, a name that represented the pinnacle of musical achievement, a ghost from their history books now made flesh. Mr. Peterson took another shaky step forward, his hands still half extended, his mind struggling to bridge the chasm of 70 years. We all thought you were gone. There was a memorial concert in '54. The Philharmonic played Brahms. I was there. We mourned you. Arthur's gaze softened as he looked at the old industrialist. He saw in Samuel Peterson's face not just the shock of a ghost's return, but the genuine grief of a fan, of a man who had truly loved the music he had once made. There wasn't much left to mourn, Arthur said, his voice quiet but clear. The man who played Brahms didn't make it back from the chosen reservoir. His hands were too cold. He saw too much. What came back was someone else. The stark, simple honesty of his words was more devastating than any accusation. He wasn't asking for their pity. He was simply stating a fact, a truth as cold and hard as the frozen ground of a Korean winter. He had left a part of his soul on that battlefield, and the music had gone with it. He turned his gaze from Peterson to the rest of the room. He saw their faces, a gallery of guilt. The woman who had joked he would snap a string was staring at her own jewel-encrusted hands, as if they were suddenly alien to her. The man who had wagered $100 he couldn't even tune the instrument was looking at the floor, his face beet red with a shame so intense it was almost pitiable. But why? A woman in the front row finally whispered, her voice trembling. A talent like yours, a gift from God. How could you just let it go? Why live like this? She gestured vaguely at his tattered clothes, her question a mixture of genuine confusion and a dawning horror at her own shallow judgment. Arthur's eyes found hers. They were not angry. They were tired, filled with a weariness that seemed to stretch back through the decades. You think this is a choice? He asked, his voice low. You think I woke up one morning and decided to trade a concert hall for a cold alley? When I came home, the world was different. Or maybe I was. The sounds in my head weren't Beethoven anymore. They were the sounds of mortars, of men crying out for their mothers in the dark. The music, it hurt. To touch a violin was to remember everything I had lost. The joy was gone, so I put it away. He paused, letting the weight of his confession settle into the silent room. I didn't want the fame. I didn't want the pity. I didn't want people looking at me and seeing a ghost of what I used to be. I just wanted quiet. I found a job on a loading dock. I worked with my hands. I found a small room. I read books. I lived a simple life, an honest life. It was enough. His words painted a picture of a self-imposed exile, a retreat from a world that no longer made sense. He had not fallen from grace. He had willingly stepped away from it, seeking a kind of peace that no amount of applause could ever provide. From his collapsed position in the chair, a choked, guttural sound emerged. It was Harrison Vance. He slowly, painfully, got to his feet. His face was a wreck, his perfect composure utterly destroyed. His eyes were red and swollen. His custom-tailored suit looked like a costume he was no longer worthy of wearing. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire world burn to the ground. He stumbled forward, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. He stopped at the foot of the stage, looking up at the man he had idolized, and then so cruelly humiliated. I, Harrison began, his voice a broken rasp. He couldn't form the words. The apology was a mountain in his throat he could not climb. The sheer, colossal scale of his arrogance, of his monstrous misjudgment, had rendered him speechless. He had built his entire identity on being the heir to this man's legacy, and he had just spat on that legacy. Arthur looked down at the broken maestro. He saw not an enemy, but a victim of the same disease that afflicted everyone else in the room, a blindness of the soul. "Your technique is flawless, Mr. Vance," Arthur said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I've heard your recordings. You play the notes perfectly." He paused, letting the faint praise hang in the air before delivering the final, devastating blow. "But you don't trust the silence between them. You're afraid of it. Because in the silence, there is truth. And that is where the music really lives." The critique was so precise, so deeply and professionally true, that it was 1,000 times more cutting than any insult. It was the assessment of a master, and it laid Harrison's soul bare. He had spent his life pursuing mechanical perfection, believing that discipline and precision were the source of art. He had never understood that art came from the messy, chaotic, painful business of being human. Harrison let out a dry, ragged sob and finally found his voice. "I am so sorry," he whispered, the words tearing from him, raw and inadequate. "I am so sorry." "Don't be sorry to me," Arthur replied, his voice firming with a steely resolve. "I am not the one you have failed." He raised his hand and pointed, not at Harrison, but at the 200 guests who stood frozen, watching the drama unfold. "Be sorry to them. You sold them a lie. You taught them that music is a prize to be won, a luxury for the rich, a wall to keep the unworthy out. You taught them that art belongs to the few. But you are wrong. Art belongs to everyone. It belongs to the hungry, to the broken, to the forgotten. It is what we have when we have nothing else. It is not a palace. It is a shelter." He then turned his attention to the crowd at large, his voice rising, taking on the commanding tone of a preacher or a general. "Look at you. You came here tonight to celebrate music by writing checks, by drinking champagne, by congratulating yourselves on your own generosity. You think that makes you patrons of the arts? You think that gives you ownership of its beauty?" He shook his head, a look of profound disappointment on his face. "You walked past a dozen men and women on the street tonight who have more music in their souls than you could ever understand. You looked through them. You saw nothing. Because you have forgotten how to see." A heavy, suffocating silence filled the ballroom. His words were not an attack. They were a diagnosis. He was holding up a mirror to their souls, and the reflection was ugly and impoverished. They had mistaken price tags for value, exclusivity for meaning. Arthur's gaze swept the room one last time, and it landed on Clara. She had risen to her feet and was watching him, her face a canvas of complex emotions, awe, shame, and a dawning sense of purpose. He gave her a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a passing of the torch. He then turned and walked off the stage. This time, no one tried to stop him. The crowd parted for him again, but it was different now. It was no longer the parting of a path for a king. It was a recoil, a collective shrinking away from a truth that was too bright, too painful to bear. They stepped back not out of respect, but out of a deep and unsettling fear. He was the ghost of a truth they had spent their entire lives trying to ignore, that a man's worth is not in his bank account, but in his heart. He walked past the groveling Mr. Gable, who was now pale and trembling, his career undoubtedly over. He walked past the 2 security guards, who now stood at attention, their faces grim and respectful, as if they were guarding a tomb. As he reached the grand archway, he paused and turned back for one final look. He saw Harrison Vance on his knees, a man utterly destroyed by the truth. He saw Samuel Peterson weeping silently, mourning a world that had lost its way. He saw 200 of the city's most powerful people looking lost and small in their temple of wealth. He had come seeking not a meal, but a reckoning, and he had found it. Arthur Morgan, the ghost of Carnegie Hall, the hero of Chosen, the anonymous man from the streets, turned and walked out of the celestial ballroom. He disappeared into the quiet anonymity of the city, leaving behind a silence that was filled with the deafening sound of shattered illusions. The lesson was complete. The symphony was over. As Arthur Morgan stepped out of the Onyx Tower and into the cold embrace of the city night, the biting wind felt like a welcome absolution. He pulled the collar of his worn jacket tighter, not against the chill, but like a man settling back into a comfortable, familiar skin. He did not look back at the glittering spire that clawed at the sky. He simply merged with the stream of anonymous souls on the sidewalk, his footsteps sure and steady, leaving no trace. He was no longer a ghost haunting the edges of their world. He was a man walking freely in his own. Back on the 80th floor, the celestial ballroom was a tomb. The champagne was flat, the opulent food untouched. 200 of the city's most powerful people stood frozen in a tableau of collective shame, the deafening silence broken only by the ragged, desperate sobs of Harrison Vance. He remained on the floor near the stage, a man hollowed out, the brilliant shell of his arrogance shattered to reveal the utter void within. His life as he knew it was over, ended not by a rival, but by a single, perfectly played note of truth. Nearby, Samuel Peterson looked from the broken man on the floor to the priceless violin resting on its velvet pedestal. A lifetime of shrewd, calculated decisions paled in comparison to the one that now formed in his mind. It was a decision born not of profit, but of debt, a debt owed to a man who had reminded him what true wealth looked like. By the service entrance, Clara Jenkins stood watching the empty archway through which Arthur had departed. The music he had played still echoed in her soul, but it was no longer just a beautiful sound. It was a calling. Her own music, her own life, now had a purpose far greater than applause. Slowly, like mourners leaving a graveside, the guests began to move. There were no goodbyes, no air kisses, no chatter about the stock market or summer homes. They collected their expensive coats and filed out into the night, their faces grim, their eyes downcast. They had arrived that evening as gods, floating above the city. They left as mere mortals, humbled, haunted, and irrevocably changed by the symphony a forgotten soldier had played for their souls. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comments section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.